Hello everyone, like, subscribe and share Talk Fanfiction audiobook for next part.
Congratulations, host, on achieving the purple tier accomplishment First Blood. First Blood, the host has killed a pirate during a marine assessment. Would you like to open the achievement gift pack? Just by the color alone, Kyoya could tell that a purple tier accomplishment was undoubtedly higher than a blue tier one. This was similar to faction rewards, a kind of welfare benefit. Kyoya guessed that if he had taken the pirate route, First Plunder, or the Revolutionary Army route, First Rebellion, there would definitely have been purple tier accomplishment rewards as well. Without hesitation, Kyoya willed it in his mind. Open. Ding. Congratulations, host, on obtaining the Buccaneer Bloodline. Buccaneer Bloodline. Hearing the reward from the One Piece achievement system, Kyoya was overjoyed. When it came to the Buccaneer race, few might know of them. But when it came to Bartholomew Kuma, hardly anyone would be unaware. Among the 7 warlords of the sea, Bartholomew Kuma was second only to the world's greatest swordsman, Dracula Mahawk, in terms of pure combat strength. Even within the navy, Kuma could reach the level admiral candidate. Part of this was due to his Paramesha type Nikyu no Mi, but another part was due to Kuma's bloodline. The Buccaneer race possessed the bloodline of the Giants. The Giants are the most powerful race in the One Piece world. At the same time, Giants were also the race with the greatest physical strength. In the One Piece world, individuals with abnormally large builds all had some degree of giant bloodline in them. Setting aside other aspects, in terms of pure strength, few could match them. Kuma had half Buccaneer bloodline, meaning he also had 1/4 giant bloodline. Now that Kyoya had obtained the Buccaneer bloodline, it was equivalent to having half giant bloodline, which would grant him a massive boost in strength. Purple light particles merged into Kyoya's soul, transforming his body and making him feel as though his entire being was heating up. This state lasted for about 3 minutes before gradually fading. Opening his eyes, Kyoya lightly clenched his fist and found that he could even produce a faint sonic boom from squeezing the air. My strength has increased by at least 30 times. After assessing his newfound power, Kyoya couldn't help but laugh wryly. Over the past few days, in order to improve his close combat strength, he had devoted all his energy to mastering a technique that combined flying slash and sword swings. However, who would have thought that before he could even perfect this technique, he would obtain the Buccaneer bloodline, boosting his strength by 30 times. Kyoya estimated that in the One Piece world, the Mink tribe was about 7 to 8 times that of normal humans. However, the Mink tribe could control static electricity through their fur and even transform into the more powerful Sulong form during a full moon, making them superior to the Fishmen's pure strength. Moving up, the Buccaneer race and the Lunarian race possessed strength over 20 times that of a human. The giant race was arguably the strongest in terms of raw power in the One Piece world, likely exceeding 50 times that of a human. Even the Oni race of Kaido probably only matched the giants at best. Giant soldiers who joined the marine were automatically given the rank of vice admiral. Of course, due to their massive size, few giants could train to master Haki, which left them somewhat lacking in high-tier combat prowess. The reason Kyoya felt his strength had increased by over 30 times was also because he was still young, and his physique hadn't yet reached its peak. Thus, the multiplier was higher. Once Kyoya's physique reached its limit, the half-giant bloodline would only double his strength by about 20 times. White, blue, purple, gold. So far, the One Piece achievement system has already displayed 4 tiers of accomplishments. White tier accomplishments are primarily related to training time. Blue tier accomplishments can grant combat skills of the same level as the Rokushiki. Gold tier accomplishments can reward top tier abilities like devil fruits and the 3 types of Haki. Purple tier accomplishments grant abilities stronger than Rokushiki but inferior to Haki and devil fruits. Perhaps even the ultimate techniques of Rokushiki, such as 6 King Gun and Life Return, also fall under purple tier rewards. Giant bloodlines and Oni bloodlines will probably all be included in the gold tier achievement. After adjusting to his newfound strength, Kyoya felt that even if he were to face Jin now, a single slash from him might send the man flying. Currently, Kyoya possessed 7th class Raryoku, while Jin had 5th class Raryoku, a difference of 2 tiers. However, the gap between 7th and 5th class Raryoku was nowhere near as extreme as a 30-fold increase in physical power. Even releasing a Zanpakuto would only amplify Ryutsu by 3 to 5 times at most. Moreover, with Kyoya's Ryutsu now enhanced, the Pika Pika no Mi's abilities he could access in his partial Shikai had also grown significantly stronger. In a life or death battle, Kyoya wasn't confident of victory. But in a mere spar, he was certain he could utterly dominate Jin now. Standing up, Kyoya drew his Zanpakuto and casually swung it, boom. A massive shockwave erupted, carving out a 3-meter wide, several centimeter deep fan-shaped crater into the ground beside him. This strike contained no concentrated Ryutsu, nor did it utilize Breath of All Things to unleash a slash, it was just an ordinary swing. Yet, this single motion produced such terrifying kanatsu, showcasing just how immense Kyoya's physical enhancement truly was. What delighted Kyoya even more was that, with his physique, both the quality and quantity of his ryutsu had far. The only issue was that the reishi's density in the human world was too low. If he were in the Seraite right now, Kyoya estimated that simply saturating his body with ambient reishi would elevate his Raryoku to 5th class, in other words, lieutenant level. Well, if we change it to the One Piece world, it would probably be at the level of an admiral candidate or the emperor's right-hand man. If Kyoya were to later obtain a real giant bloodline, or Kaido's Oni bloodline, or even the bloodline of someone like Douglas Bullet, his Raryoku would likely reach 4th class at minimum. Though still below captain level of 3rd class Raryoku, that would still place him as the strongest beneath them. Of course, in both the One Piece world and Bleach world, battles were never decided by raw power alone. In One Piece world, factors like combat skills, haki, ultimate techniques, and devil fruit abilities all influenced the outcome. In Bleach, Ryutsu, Zanjutsu, Hakuda, Hoho Kido, and Zanpakuto's abilities were equally decisive in determining victory. 10/5, 5:14 p.m. Singranbir 68007, Chapter 31. Aizen's attention. No matter which world it was, possessing great power always provided a certain advantage in battle. Kyoya has gotten stronger again. Witnessing the commotion caused by Kyoya's training, both the students and the examining Shinigami couldn't help but think this. A hint of bitterness flickered in their hearts, but they quickly suppressed it. There was no point in comparing themselves to him. The more they compared, the more they'd only end up feeling inferior. In the days that followed, Kyoya's life returned to its usual routine. One flying slash after another shot into the sky. Compared to his previous attacks, the slashes Kyoya unleashed after his power increase were far superior in speed, force, and scale. This improvement brought some small challenges to his training. Fortunately, once Kyoya adapted to his sudden surge in strength, his progress picked up again. Admittedly, with his current level of power, there weren't many who could match the intensity of his flying slashes. But once this technique was fully mastered, it would still greatly enhance Kyoya's combat effectiveness. Since he had nothing else to focus on at the moment, Kyoya continued diligently practicing his swordsmanship. During this period, 2 hollows appeared in Zone 7, which was under the responsibility of Kyoya's group. Kyoya didn't intervene in either battle, and they were purified by Fujita and Otomo working together. After personally slaying the hollows, Kyoya could tell Fujita and Otomo had grown noticeably more confident. Congratulations, you have passed this assessment. At this moment, on the training grounds of the Shino Academy, only 7 examinees stood before the examiner alongside Kyoya. Out of the 27 students who participated, 2 had died, 7 were injured, and 11 had failed, unable to defeat the hollows they faced and forced to call for rescue. A pass rate of less than 1/4. However, though the number of successful candidates was small, each one could be considered an elite among the students. Even Fujita and Otomo, who were seen as having latched onto Kyoya's coattails, had successfully slain hollows on their own. Next, you may state which squad you wish to join. My team and I will arrange for you to be sent to your respective divisions. Of course, if any division takes an interest in you, they may dispatch members to personally escort you. As he said this, the Shinigami's gaze lingered on Kyoya. Among all the examinees, Kyoya was the only one who stood out as exceptional, the rest were merely passable. If any of them were to catch the attention of the higher-ups in the Gote 13, it would undoubtedly be Kyoya. Besides, they had already heard rumors Lieutenant Aizen of the 5th Division held Kyoya in high regard and had even sent subordinates to the academy to extend an invitation. If Kyoya joined the 5th Division, it wouldn't be long before he rose to the rank of seated officer, just like the examiner himself. However, the examiner's own strength had already reached its limit, with little room for further growth. But Kyoya, he had the makings of a future lieutenant, perhaps even the potential to become a captain someday. Sir, I wish to join the 11th Division. Seeing the Shinigami's gaze fixed on him, Kyoya assumed he was being addressed and responded without hesitation. Being asked for his preference, Kyoya answered without hesitation. The 11th Division, not the 5th, I did receive an invitation from Lieutenant Aizen before. Kyoya shook his head, but the 5th Division is a support squad. It doesn't suit me. In comparison, the 11th Division is a combat-focused squad. I feel that's a better fit for me. Understood. The Shinigami was momentarily taken aback. He couldn't fathom why Kyoya would turn down a smooth path to success in favor of joining that brigade of brutes. But perhaps this was just the eccentricity of a genius. Or maybe, it was because of Ichimaru Jin in the 5th Division. After all, there had been a time when Kyoya and Ichimaru Jin were often compared to one another. Jin had graduated from the Shino Academy in just 1 year, setting the record for the fastest graduation in the academy's history. Now, however, that record hadn't even lasted a full year before being broken by Kyoya. It was only natural to assume that there might be some friction between Kyoya and Jin. With this in mind, the Shinigami didn't press further. Instead, he turned to the other examinees. Is there anyone else who wishes to join the 11th Division? If so, I'll take you all there together. The remaining 6 students exchanged glances before shaking their heads in unison. True, Kyoya was a genius. Barring any unforeseen circumstances, he would be the strongest Shinigami they would ever interact with. If they had any sort of camaraderie with him, they might have gambled on joining the 11th Division alongside him, hoping for his protection. But unfortunately, Kyoya had skipped grades to join Class 6A midway through the term. He spent most of his time training alone and had little interaction with the others. Under these circumstances, they weren't willing to bet their lives on the vague notion of classmate bonds with Kyoya. After all, the 11th Division had the highest mortality rate in the Gotei 13. With their current strength, if they joined without any backing, they could easily die in their first major battle. Even Fujita and Otomo, who had been in the same team as Kyoya in the assessment, gave up on the idea of joining the same division as him. The others, 10/5, 5:17 p.m. Singrandir 68007, Chapter 32 11th Division. The smile on Jin's face faded slightly. Though I hate to admit it, Kyoya-kun is a greater genius than I am. Jin's mind flashed back to the battle he had with Kyoya 2 months prior. By all accounts, Jin was superior in every way. Ryutsu, physical ability, speed, strength, skill. A complete overwhelming advantage. Logically speaking, with such a gap, he should have been able to defeat Kyoya instantly. It wasn't just that Kyoya was weaker than him, even those with greater Ryutsu than his had ultimately fallen to his blade. However, in his fight against Kyoya, Jin felt as though every move he made had been seen through. What kind of combat talent was that? Even after he released his Zanpakuto, Kyoya. It's precisely because the gap between him and other Shinigami was so vast that Aizen found it impossible to relate to them. Even someone like Jin, whom others considered a monster, was merely passable in Aizen's eyes. He had taken Jin under his wing simply to see what surprises the boy might bring. As for Kyoya, well, though rumors circulated that Kyoya was a monster, comparable to Jin, to Aizen, Kyoya's low Ryutsu was a fatal flaw. Even if Kyoya had remarkable talent in Zanjutsu, his ceiling was already determined by his Ryutsu. But now, hearing Jin speak like this, Aizen found himself genuinely intrigued by Kyoya. At the same time, Kyoya's growth also gave Aizen some new thoughts about the students of the. Unleashed his full power, Aizen might be severely wounded in an instant. This was the difference between the strongest illusion-type Zanpakuto and the strongest fire-type Zanpakuto. Though, 1,000 years later, the likelihood of Yamamoto fully releasing his power was slim, Aizen wasn't willing to take even the slightest risk. At the very least, until he achieved his goals, he wouldn't allow himself to be exposed before Yamamoto. Therefore, to minimize the risk of exposure, he decided that from now on, he would make time every year to visit the Shino Academy, to broaden the students' horizons, let them witness the power of Shikai early, and ignite. After nodding and thanking the Shinigami who had brought him here, Kyoya stepped through the gates. Contrary to his expectations, Kyoya wasn't greeted by any welcoming division's members. In fact, there wasn't even a guard stationed at the entrance. Releasing his observation haki, Kyoya quickly sensed the largest concentration of Ryutsu and headed in that direction. At the training grounds, a crowd of Shinigami had gathered, and one of them finally noticed Kyoya. "Oi, whose kid is this? This isn't a playground." Scram. The first 11th Division member to spot Kyoya casually waved him off, expecting him to leave on his own. Then, he turned back to watch the fight between 2 Shinigami at the center of the crowd. The 11th Division is the combat division. Therefore, even if its members weren't all battle maniacs, the division's atmosphere ensured that every Shinigami here had an intense passion for fighting. Today, there was a seated officer challenge, which had drawn a large audience. Normally, few outsiders visited the 11th Division, so even the gatekeepers had come to the training grounds, which was why Kyoya had been able to walk in unhindered. "I'm Kyoya, a newly graduated student from the Shino Academy, here to join the 11th Division. Excuse me, where should I go to register now?" Oh, hearing this, the surrounding Shinigami seemed to remember. Ah, right. Last month was the Academy's exam period, so recruits should be arriving around now. But kid, shouldn't you be heading to the 4th Division instead? 10/5, 5:35 p.m. Singrandir 68007, Chapter 33 Inquiry. With Kyoya's appearance, he simply didn't fit in with the rough-and-tumble guys of the 11th Division, did he? Compared to healing arts like Kaido, I think fighting with a Zanpakuto suits me better. Patting the Zanpakuto at his waist, Kyoya grinned at the laughing group. Seeing Kyoya's expression, the Shinigami who had been about to tease him paused for a moment before clapping him on the shoulder. "Ha ha ha, well said. A real man should fight with steel and blood. Those sissy healing arts, not even dogs would learn that." Hearing this, the corner of Kyoya's mouth twitched. "Are you kidding me? Is it okay to say something like that?" Not to mention the current captain of the 4th Division, who is also the first-generation Kenpachi of the 11th Division. In fact, among the entire Gotei 13, the division that interacted most with the 4th Division was the 11th Division. Whether it was battles against hollows or sparring matches among the 11th Division members, nearly every day, countless injured were sent to the 4th Division. If the Shinigami of the 4th Division heard the 11th Division members calling them sissies, there was no doubt that the 11th Division would receive some special treatment from the 4th Division in the future. Of course, as the Medical and Relief Division, the 4th Division wouldn't tarnish their own reputation. But during treatment, well, some of the less polished techniques, or the fresh recruits who had just joined the division, would surely leave a lasting impression on the division's members. After this battle, I'll personally take you into the division. Thanks, Senpai. By the way, do those two Senpai up ahead have some kind of grudge? It looks like neither of them is holding back in their fight. Hey, isn't that obvious? Hearing Kyoya's question, the overly friendly Shinigami replied, in battle, going all out is the only way to show respect, both to your opponent and to yourself. If you've already drawn your sword, then you've already prepared to fight to the death. Cut the crap, Tanaka. Don't mislead the new guy. Another Shinigami rolled his eyes at the one named Tanaka and smiled at Kyoya. Listen, rookie, don't let Tanaka fool you. Normally, our internal spars in the 11th Division aren't this intense. We usually stop once the winner is decided. The reason those two are going all out is because this is a seat challenge. As if worried Kyoya didn't understand, the Shinigami kindly explained, a seat challenge is the only type of fight in the 11th Division where death is permitted. Any member of the 11th Division can challenge a seated officer, the lieutenant, or even the captain directly. If they win, they take that person's position. Even the captain isn't exempt. So, to defend their rank, the challenge will fight the challenger with everything they've got. In situations like this, the two might as well be enemies. That's why casualties are common in these fights. So, rookie, remember, unless you're confident you can survive, don't start a seat challenge. Otherwise, if you lose, no one can save you. Thank you. Kyoya could tell when someone meant well. But unfortunately, he might have to disappoint this senior. He hadn't joined the 11th Division just to enjoy the thrill of battle like the lower-ranked members. He was here because the 11th Division was the fastest path to promotion, as long as one had the strength. Seated officers, lieutenant, even captain, none of it was out of reach. From what Kyoya knew, the fastest climber in the 11th Division's history was the 11th Kenpachi. Zaraki Kenpachi. That guy went from joining the 11th Division to becoming its captain in just a few minutes. By the way, Senpai, who's the current captain of our division? Because of the uncertainty about the timeline, Kyoya didn't know who the 11th Division captain was right now. All he knew was that the 7th Kenpachi, Kuruyashiki Kenpachi, had one of the longer tenures as captain. After Kuruyashiki, Azashiro Kenpachi only served as captain for less than 3 years before surrendering himself after attempting to destroy the Seraite and being imprisoned in Muken. Following that, Azashiro's lieutenant, Gosen, succeeded him as the 9th Kenpachi, becoming Gosen Kenpachi. At the same time, he became the weakest captain in the history of the 11th Division. Since he was the weakest, Gosen likely didn't even last a full year in the position before being killed by Kigenho, who then became the 10th Kenpachi. Kyoya wasn't sure how long Kigenho held the position. However, 100 years before the start of the main Bleach storyline, during the captain's meeting, the captain of the 11th Division was already Zaraki Kenpachi. In other words, within just 5 years, the 11th Division had passed through 3 captains. Well, 4, if Zaraki is included. Knowing who the current captain was would help Kyoya plan his challenges more effectively. You don't know. The moment the Shinigami said this, he smacked his own forehead. Ah, sorry, I forgot you just graduated from the Shino Academy today. You probably don't know much about the Gote 13 yet. You probably just want to join our division because we're the combat division, right? Speaking of which, didn't the Shino Academy recently produce some kind of genius? Do you know him? If you do, maybe I can take you to the lieutenant and have him approve you going back to the academy to recruit him for our division. Senpai, what if I told you that I am the genius you're talking about? Kyoya was speechless. He hadn't expected that the 2 seniors who had been the first to talk to him, and the most friendly, would turn out to be so unreliable. They'd chatted with him for so long, yet they still hadn't answered his actual question. You, doesn't look like it. The 2 11th Division members looked Kyoya up and down before shaking their heads in unison. Sigh, Kyoya rolled his eyes and said, Senpai, just tell me who our captain and lieutenant are. I don't want to accidentally offend them later because I don't recognize them. 10/5, 5:38 p.m. Singranveer 68007, Chapter 34 Kigenho Kenpachi. Compared to the Shinigami who were incorporated into the Hoeiko Mundo Expeditionary Force, those Shinigami who managed to join the Gote 13 were considered geniuses. However, their future limits would likely only reach around the 7th or 8th level of Ryutsu. Those who could achieve the 6th level of Ryutsu and complete their Zanpakudo's Shikai to become seated officers were geniuses among geniuses. Out of 100, there might not even be one. Yet, even such geniuses were merely stepping stones to those who were even more extraordinary. On the other hand, Kyoya's age also played a role. Yes, this might sound contradictory, but it was logically consistent. They looked down on Kyoya because of his young age, believing that even if he had talent, he couldn't be that strong yet. But at the same time, they also recognized Kyoya's potential, given that he had passed the Shino Academy's exams and joined the Gote 13 at such a young age. At the very least, they weren't arrogant enough to assume that Kyoya would never surpass them in the future. If they bullied Kyoya now, once he grew stronger, they would suffer the consequences. Villains weren't stupid. On the contrary, they were often smarter than ordinary people, knowing exactly who they could afford to mess with and who they couldn't. Of course, in this case, Kyoya didn't think these two seniors were necessarily bad people. It was just that, whether in the One Piece world or elsewhere, one couldn't simply define a person as purely good or evil. The current captain of the 11th Division is Kigenho-sama. As for the lieutenant, it's Ichino's Maki-sama. Kigenho and Ichino's Maki. Kyoya nodded in understanding. Good, the best possible starting point for me. The 9th Kenpachi, Gosuke Kenpachi, was the weakest captain in the history of the 11th Division, no, in the entire Gote 13's history. He didn't even possess captain-level strength. Though he became captain due to the 11th Division's unique traditions, the other division's captains looked down on him. Even Kyoraku Shunsui didn't bother mentioning Gosuke's name when talking about him. The fact that Kigenho could hold the position of captain in the 11th Division for a while meant he must have achieved Bankai. Kyoya estimated that Kigenjo's strength was probably similar to Madarame Makaku's, barely reaching the threshold of captain level. With that level of strength, Kyoya believed that once he obtained lieutenant's position and unlocked the rewards from the One Piece achievement system, defeating Kigenho wouldn't be too difficult. Once Kyoya became the captain of the 11th Division, he would undoubtedly earn the Marine Admiral Gold Tier achievement. At that point, his strength would receive another significant boost, allowing him to stand firm among the captains. Even if Zaraki showed up later, Kyoya might still have a chance at defeating him. As for whether he could defeat Ichino's Maki, Kyoya had no doubt about it. Ichino's Zanpakuto is the light-type Nijigasumi which could use light refraction to conceal himself and also convert it into blades for attack. In the future, after Kigenho was killed by Zaraki, Ichino's, unable to accept this, defected from the Seraite and later became a subordinate of the bounce leader, Kariya Jin. Even at that time, Ichino's hadn't achieved Bankai. Clearly, his limit was only lieutenant level. Coincidentally, Kyoya's Zanpakuto, the Pika Pika no Mi, was the strongest light-type Zanpakuto, making it a perfect counter to Ichino's Zanpakuto's abilities. It can be said that even though Kyoya's Raryoku has not yet reached the 5th class, which is the lieutenant level, his chances of defeating Ichino's in a fight were still high. As Kyoya pondered this, the battle on the training ground was nearing its end. Kill. With their respective shouts, the two combatants unleashed their full Ryutsu, staking their lives on this final clash. Boom. As the dust from the violent collision settled, the two figures on the training ground stood drenched in blood, gasping heavily. Damn it, the Shinigami on the left seemed to want to say something, but the moment he opened his mouth, he coughed up a mouthful of blood. After swaying unsteadily for a few moments, he collapsed face first onto the ground. This battle is my victory. Only then did the standing Shinigami raise his Zanpakuto high and roar in triumph. Oh, the surrounding members of the 11th Division erupted in cheers, raising their fists in celebration of the victor. Even Kyoya found himself swept up in their fervor. There was no denying it, the Shinigami of the 11th Division were a straightforward bunch. They revered strength. They followed strength. Ha 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 ha, well done. A booming voice suddenly cut through the cheers, nearly drowning them out entirely. Hojo, as captain of the 11th Division, I acknowledge the validity of your challenge. Hearing this, Kyoya turned toward the source of the voice, but due to his height, all he could see were the backs of the other Shinigami. Sighing inwardly, Kyoya gathered Reishi beneath his feet, gently lifting himself just enough to rise above the crowd. Then, Kyoya saw the person who was speaking. He is a man nearly 3 meters tall, his body so massive and muscular it seemed inhuman. His barrel-like belly, his brutish face, his spiky black hair jutting out like a sea urchin's spines, and his thick, wild beard only amplified his ferocious appearance. The current captain of the 11th Division, the 10th generation Kenpachi, Kigenho Kenpachi. The title of Kenpachi belonged to the strongest Shinigami in the Seraite. The previous holders of the name had lived up to that legacy. Unfortunately, ever since the 8th Kenpachi, Azashiro Kenpachi, was imprisoned in Muken, the reigns of Gosen Kenpachi and Kigenho had tarnished the title's prestige. Now then, while we're at it, does anyone else wish to challenge a seated officer? After ordering some men to carry the victor away for treatment, Kigenho grinned, his expression twisting into something even more savage. Or, perhaps one of you would like to challenge me. In the 11th Division, as long as you had the strength, you could challenge anyone of higher rank. However, such challenges couldn't be issued at any time. To challenge the captain, it needs the witness of at least 200 division members to be valid. To challenge the chief officer, more than 100 division members are needed to witness it. Because of this, whenever a challenge occurred in the 11th division, nearly every available member would gather to watch. For one, observing the battles of their strongest fighters could provide valuable insight for their own growth. Secondly, knowing the strength of their comrades meant that in life or death missions, they'd know exactly who to call for backup. And finally, they were there to serve as official witnesses. Right now, the crowd surrounding the training ground numbered well over 200, which met the requirements for challenging the captain. This is also the reason why Kikenho asked this. 10/5, 5:41 p.m. Singranveer 68007, Chapter 35 Challenging a Seated Officer. Of course, Kajinjo's words stemmed from absolute confidence in his own strength. Within the entire 11th division, he was the only one who had successfully mastered Bankai. As for the others, even his lieutenant, Ichino's Maki, in Kajinjo's eyes, they were nothing more than weaklings. Whether it was 1-on-1, 1 against 10, or even 1 against 100, Kajinjo was certain he would emerge victorious. After achieving Bankai, Kajinjo had come to understand its overwhelming power. This was not a gap that could be bridged by sheer numbers. In Kajinjo's mind, only the other 12 divisions, captains were worth his slight consideration. Ha ha ha, Captain, how could we ever be a match for you? Hearing Kajinjo's words, the members of the 11th division broke out in cold sweat, responding awkwardly. As members of the 11th division, they loved battle, but fighting against Captain Kajinjo was an exception. Kajinjo's strength far surpassed theirs. Under normal circumstances, he could control the force of his attacks well enough to provide combat training for his subordinates. But unfortunately, Kajinjo had no intention of nurturing his division's members. To him, sparring with his subordinates was merely a form of entertainment. Especially when it came to breaking their limbs and listening to their screams, that was what truly excited Kajinjo. Among the 11th Division's ranks, only the newest recruits believed they could gain valuable training from the more seasoned veterans, the others had long since learned nature and knew better than to seek unnecessary suffering. Of course, if no one volunteered to entertain Kajinjo for too long, he would simply pick out a few subordinates at random to play with. Therefore, in order to avoid such situations, the veterans generally didn't warn newcomers about the dangers of sparring with their captain. However, no new recruits had joined the 11th Division recently. The last batch of newcomers had suffered severe injuries at Kajinjo's hands, 2 had died before the 4th Division's medics could arrive, and the rest had transferred to other divisions. For a moment, aside from the few Shinigami closest to Kajinjo offering flattery, no one stepped forward. TCH, how boring. Seeing this, Kajinjo frowned, already considering randomly selecting a few unlucky souls to play with. But at that moment, a child's voice suddenly rang out. I'll do it. Hearing this unfamiliar voice, all the Shinigami in the training ground turned their attention toward its source. Amidst a crowd of rough-looking men, Kyoya stood out like a sore thumb. For one, his height was lacking, so he had to hover slightly above the ground using reishi just to stand half a head taller than the surrounding Shinigami. Moreover, while all the 11th Division's members wore black shihakusho, Kyoya, having yet to officially register, was still dressed in his white Shino Academy uniform. Oh, this brat's got guts. Do we even have someone like this in our division? Are you stupid? Just look at his clothes, he must. Graduated from Shino Academy. TCH. Graduating at such a young age, must be a genius. What do we do? Should we stop him? As the Shinigami around Kyoya stepped back, clearing a path, he dispersed the reishi beneath his feet and walked toward the center of the training ground. Standing in front of Kajinjo, Kyoya looked up. From this angle, he had to admit the man's imposing presence was genuinely intimidating. From Kajinjo's body, Kyoya could feel the overwhelming reishi. The gap was still far too wide. But soon, very soon. Captain, I want to challenge a seated officer. Hiss. As Kyoya's words fell, the surrounding Shinigami collectively sucked in a sharp breath. Even those who had intended to warn Kyoya earlier now stared at him in shock. Seated officers were no small matter, not just anyone could hold such a position. In every division, including the lieutenant, there were only 20 seated officers. The most basic requirement to become a seated officer was the ability to release one's Zanpakudo. If a division didn't have 20 Shinigami capable of Shikai, the seated officers' positions would remain vacant. Of course, some divisions had fewer, while others had more. In the stronger divisions, the number of Shinigami who could achieve Shikai exceeded 20, so naturally, only selected. As one of the combat-focused divisions in the Gotei, the members' division's overall strength was second only to the 1st Division. Many seated officers in other divisions had originally come from the 11th. In other words, every seated officer in the 11th Division was an elite among elites. For Kyoya to openly challenge a seated officer meant he, too, had mastered Shikai, a level of strength surpassing 80% of the Shinigami present. With such strength, he would not die easily even if fighting with the captain. Ha 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 ha, interesting, interesting. Kigenho roared with laughter, his voice so loud it made Kyoya's ears ring. Kid, what's your name? Captain, my name is Kyoya. I just graduated today and intend to join the 11th Division. Good, Kyoya, was it? I like your spirit, hope you can give me some entertainment. After saying this, Kigenho turned and bellowed at the surrounding Shinigami, hey, you. The newbie's issuing a challenge. Get out here, the lowest rank one, step up. Don't make me call you twice. Hearing Kigenjo's words, Kyoya inwardly shook his head. To not even know the names of his own division's seated officers, or perhaps he knew but couldn't be bothered to say them, this captain was truly pathetic. But whatever, if I were in his position, I wasn't sure I'd remember the names and faces of every Shinigami in the division either. With Kyoya's current strength, challenging the lieutenant, Ichino's Maki, wouldn't be too difficult. However, Kyoya was worried that if he defeated ID, he became the 11th Division's lieutenant, challenging the rower. Ranked seated officers afterward might not yield any achievement rewards. Therefore, to milk the system for all it was worth, Kyoya decided to challenge his way up from the lowest seated officer all the way to lieutenant. That way, he could unlock all the Marines' rank achievements and claim multiple rewards. Anyway, there are only 20 people at most. 10 minutes, no, better to be humble. Let's say half an hour. At that rate, each fight would last just over a minute, which is more than enough. Coming, Captain. While Kyoya silently calculated how long it would take to complete the Marines' rank achievement challenges, the 11th Division's lowest ranked seated officer finally stepped forward. He is a middle-aged bald man who looked to be in his 30s. He bowed slightly to Kyoya and said, I am Noguchi Ozawa, 20th seat of the 11th Division. Please take care of me. 10/5, 5:41 p.m. Singgrandir 68007, Chapter 36 Gap. Kyoya, a new member of the 11th Division, please take care of me. Since his opponent was polite, Kyoya naturally responded in kind. After bowing respectfully, Kyoya introduced himself as well. Kyoya, why does that name sound so familiar? Hearing Kyoya's name, some of the Shinigami in the 11th Division scratched their heads, feeling like they'd heard it somewhere before. Kyoya, isn't that the genius from the Shino Academy who's been compared to Ichimaru Jin recently? Ah, now that you mention it, I remember. To think he actually joined our 11th Division. Soon, the Shinigami of the 11th Division all recognized Kyoya. Over the past year, rumors about Kyoya had spread widely among the Gote 13, becoming a common topic of conversation among Shinigami during their downtime. However, some of these rumors were so exaggerated that they were hard to believe. Things like, a Zanjutsu prodigy unseen in thousands of years, or how he could unleash Kanatsu, a technique only captain-level fighters could wield, after just a month of basic training. Or how he was said to rival, or even surpass, last year's genius, Ichimaru Jin. After all, Jin, who had broken the record for the shortest graduation time in Shino Academy's history, wasn't just a genius. He was a straight-up monster. Those who had followed Jin's career knew that after the 5th Division, he became a seated officer in less than a year. Now, Jin had even risen to a high-ranking seated officer. Was the 5th seat of the 5th Division. Comparing Kyoya to Jin, those who hadn't seen Kyoya in action felt the claims were too far-fetched. But now, it seemed they simply hadn't understood what a true genius looked like. Kyoya was every bit the equal of Jin. So it's him. No wonder he's challenging a seated officer right after joining the 11th Division. If it's Kyoya, he might actually pull it off. Hard to say, but if I recall, Kyoya hasn't even been at Shino Academy for a full year yet, right? Exactly. By my count, he's still got about a month left. TCH, impressive. That breaks Ichimaru Jin's record. The surrounding Shinigami weren't speaking quietly, so Noguchi Ozawa naturally overheard his comrade's discussion and learned Kyoya's identity. Kyoya, perhaps, in the future, I'll take pride in having fought against you today. Ozawa drew his Zanpakuto, his expression grave. As a seated officer of the 11th Division, even if just the lowest seat, Ozawa's strength was nothing to scoff at. However, the surrounding Shinigami had said, if his opponent was Kyoya, he might truly be outmatched. After all, according to the rumors, Kyoya was someone capable of unleashing Kanatsu. Rage forth, Uranami! As Ozawa shouted, dense Ryutsu erupted from his body, and his Zanpakuto began to change form. In a flash, the Zanpakuto in Ozawa's hand transformed into a pair of deep blue dual maces. Without hesitation, Ozawa released his Zanpakuto, going all out from the start. Boom! Ryutsu exploded beneath his feet as Ozawa raised his dual maces high and brought them crashing down toward Kyoya. Torrential smash. White Ryutsu gathered around the maces, surging toward Kyoya like a tidal wave facing Ozawa's attack. Kyoya slowly drew his Zanpakuto and simply swung downward. Boom! A deafening roar erupted as the wave Ozawa had summoned was instantly split apart by Kyoya's slash. Then, as if meeting no resistance at all, Kyoya's Zanpakuto clashed against Ozawa's maces. Boom! Bang! Like a fly swatter smacking a fly, Ozawa was sent flying with almost no chance to resist, utterly overwhelmed by Kyoya's strike. PFF'd, with just one strike, Kyoya had utterly crushed Ozawa. The man tumbled across the ground, coughing up a mouthful of blood before his Zanpakuto reverted to its sealed form. Kyoya had literally shattered Ozawa's Shikai state with sheer force. So strong, Ozawa struggled to flip himself over, his arms trembling as he propped himself up. Cracks had split open between his fingers, blood wounds. At this moment, there was a hint of fear in Ozawa's eyes. Looked at Kyoya, what kind of monstrous strength was that? Was this really the power of a child? In terms of raw physical power alone, Kyoya might even rival Kigenho-sama, right? At the very least, Ozawa had never been one-shot by Kigenho like this before. Too weak. In stark contrast to Ozawa's shock, Kyoya felt nothing but disappointment after their single clash. Even the lowest seed of the 11th division was far too weak against him. Of course, Kyoya knew the reason. His newly acquired Buccaneer bloodline had boosted his strength to 30 times from before. Without this enhancement, he would have needed to use Flying Slash to quickly defeat an opponent like Ozawa. The power boost from the Buccaneer bloodline was immense, comparable to when he first obtained Observation Haki. This is not to say that Buccaneer bloodline can be compared with the Observation Haki. From the levels of the One Piece achievement system, it can be seen that the Buccaneer bloodline is only a purple tier achievement reward, while the Observation Haki is a gold tier achievement reward. The gap between the two is obvious. However, while Kyoya's Observation Haki remained at its most basic level, as it had not been properly trained yet, the Buccaneer bloodline took immediate effect, directly amplifying his physical strength the moment it fused with his body. Once Kyoya's body fully matured, the Buccaneer bloodline's enhancement would reach its peak. But the Observation Haki is different. This is an ultimate ability capable of developing reading. With his strength multiplied 30-fold, Kyoya could now casually unleash Kanatsu with every swing. Opponents of Ozawa's level couldn't even withstand a single strike. I admit defeat. Ozawa forced himself up from the ground, his smile bitter. He had foolishly believed that despite Kyoya's youth, he might still put up a fight even if the boy was stronger. But reality proved far crueler than he imagined. He had even released his Zanpakuto, but he couldn't even block one slash from Kyoya. In fact, Ozawa suspected that had he not used Shikai, that single strike might have killed him outright. 10/5, 5:46 p.m. Singbrandir 68007, Chapter 37 Consecutive Battles. So strong. Is this guy really just 10 years old? On the 11th Division's training grounds, many Shinigami were stunned by Kyoya's slash. No matter how you looked at it, Ozawa was a seated officer of the 11th Division, a fighter whose strength was acknowledged by everyone. Within the 11th Division, he ranked among the top 21. Yet, such a strong fighter was effortlessly defeated by Kyoya with a single strike. The gap was simply too vast. Ha 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 ha, good, finally, someone interesting has joined the 11th Division. Kigenho slapped his thigh and pointed at Kyoya, laughing loudly, "Kid, with your strength, staying in the lowest seat is a waste. What do you say? Want to keep challenging higher seats? If you're willing, you can even challenge me. And I might just spare your life." As he spoke, a cunning glint flashed in Kigenjo's eyes. He wanted Kyoya to challenge him right now. It has to be said that Kyoya's appearance had stirred a long-dormant sense of crisis in Kigenjo's heart. As the captain of the 11th Division, Kigenho had enjoyed a lifestyle over the years that he could never have dreamed of in the past. No matter how recklessly he acted, as long as he didn't violate the Soul Society's rules, no one would question him. To maintain his position, Kigenho frequently sparred subordinates. Whenever he noticed someone with download APCO grow strong enough to threaten him, he would MI into challenging him, giving him a legitimate reason to cripple. Kigenjo's cruelty and brutality were fully displayed in these actions. Of course, if a potential threat never challenged him, Kigenho couldn't outright attack them without drawing suspicion. In such cases, he would use various means to pressure those subordinates into transferring to other divisions. This way, he ensured the 11th Division remained entirely under his control. Without a doubt, though Kyoya had only fought once, his performance had already put Kigenho on guard. "Yes, Captain, I choose to continue challenging higher seats." Kyoya nodded. "As for challenging you, I think I'll wait until after I defeat Lieutenant Ichino's. If I can't even defeat Lieutenant Ichino's, then challenging you, Captain, would be sheer ignorance of my own limitations. Only by standing in the position closest to you before issuing a challenge can I properly express my respect for you." To be honest, Kigenjo's offer was somewhat tempting to Kyoya. Unfortunately, Kyoya's current strength was still far below Kigenjo's. What puzzled Kyoya even more was that after defeating the 11th Division's lowest seat, Noguchi Ozawa, he didn't hear the One Piece achievement system's notification. Had defeating a division's lowest seat not counted as an achievement? Kyoya frowned slightly. Things weren't going as he'd expected. If none of his upcoming battles triggered an achievement, his strength wouldn't see any immediate improvements. That would be a serious setback for his plans. But now that he'd come this far, he had no choice through At the very least, after defeating Ichino's and becoming the 11th Division's lieutenant, he could figure out his next move. Otherwise, Kyoya glanced at Kigenho. To his surprise, his observation haki had sensed killing intent from this captain. Good. Then, Kyoya, let me see your limits. Someone, call all the seated officers who aren't here. Tell them to come and witness what a true genius looks like. Yes, Captain. Boom, ah, crack, ah, boom. Goo, under the watchful eyes of countless Shinigami, one seated officer after another fell beneath Kyoya's sword. Just like Ozawa, none of the seated officers dared to underestimate Kyoya after he initiated consecutive challenges. At the start of each battle, every opponent brought out their full strength. But unfortunately, in front of Kyoya, they were no different from Ozawa. Too strong. Just by swinging his sword, he's defeated so many seated officers. Could Kyoya-sama really challenge Kigenho-sama? At this point, many Shinigami no longer saw Kigenjo's earlier words as a joke. Kyoya truly possessed the strength to challenge Kigenho. How many is that now? 12. Tisk. Kyoya-sama's strikes seem to be getting heavier. Yeah, I noticed. Probably because the top 10 seated officers are stronger, forcing him to use more power in battle. That makes sense. Even if we can't see the difference, the fact that Kyoya-sama is exerting more effort means the seated officer's strength is increasing with each rank. At the center of the training grounds, just as the Shinigami had observed, Kyoya's attacks were indeed growing fiercer. But it wasn't because the seated officers were getting stronger, forcing him to increase his strength. The truth was, after defeating over a dozen seated officers without hearing the One Piece Achievement System's notification, Kyoya was growing increasingly frustrated. He wanted to end these battles quickly so he could figure out what was wrong with his system. Seated officers in a Gotei 13 division were, by all accounts, equivalent to commissioned officers in the One Piece world. The top 5 could even rival Marines vice admirals in strength. Though the later challengers held higher ranks, Kyoya didn't feel any significant difference between them and the earlier opponents. With this mindset, Kyoya naturally wanted to wrap things up as soon as possible. Next, gulp. Hearing Kyoya's cold, indifferent voice, one of the Shinigami couldn't help but swallow hard. Was this guy even a Shinigami? Had he woken up too early or gone to bed too late? That's enough, Yano. A slender hand rested on the Shinigami's shoulder as a calm voice spoke into his ear. There's not much difference between your strength and the others who've already fought. If you go out there now, your fate won't be any different from theirs. Let me handle this. The Shinigami turned his head, his pupils contracting sharply. Ichino-sama. I'm sorry, no need to apologize, Yano. Even I can't help but feel envy when facing a genius like this. 10/5, 5:52 p.m. Singrandir 68007, Chapter 38 Kyoya vs. Ichino's Maki. Maki's words weren't merely meant to comfort the Shinigami named Yano. Over the course of these dozen or so battles, Kyoya had done nothing more than swing his sword, yet the overwhelming force behind each strike had completely overwhelmed the seated officers of the 11th Division. Well, this was also partly due to the 11th Division's combat philosophy. As a battle-focused division, they advocated direct, head-on clashes, which meant most of their Zanpakuto were straightforward, attack-oriented types. Such Zanpakuto allowed them to leverage superior combat skills and experience to defeat opponents of similar strength. However, when facing an adversary whose raw power surpassed theirs, this became their weakness. Even if their Ryutsu was a full rank higher than Kyoya's, the 30-fold difference in physical strength made it impossible for them to withstand even a casual slash from him. Perhaps a Kido-type Zanpakuto would have some advantage against Kyoya. But unfortunately, Kido-type Zanpakuto were looked down upon in the 11th Division. Therefore, under normal circumstances, Shinigami who possessed Kido-type Zanpakuto either refrained from using them or transferred to other divisions. Of course, strength always spoke for itself. Those who transferred were invariably the weaker ones. Powerful Shinigami, even if their Zanpakuto were Kido-type, still held corresponding status and authority within the 11th Division. Ichino's was one such example. Even though his Zanpakuto was a light type, he remained. Chapter 38 Kyoya vs. Ichino's Maki. Maki's words weren't merely meant to comfort the Shinigami named Yano. Over the course of these dozen or so battles, Kyoya had done nothing more than swing his sword, yet the overwhelming force behind each strike had completely overwhelmed the seated officers of the 11th Division. Well, this was also partly due to the 11th Division's combat philosophy. As a battle-focused division, they advocated direct, head-on clashes, which meant most of their Zanpakuto were straightforward, attack-oriented types. Such Zanpakuto allowed them to leverage superior combat skills and experience to defeat opponents of similar strength. However, when facing an adversary whose raw power surpassed theirs, this became their weakness. Even if their Ryutsu was a full rank higher than Kyoya's, the 30-fold difference in physical strength made it impossible for them to withstand even a casual slash from him. Perhaps a Kido-type Zanpakuto would have some advantage against Kyoya. But unfortunately, Kido-type Zanpakuto were looked down upon in the 11th Division. Therefore, under normal circumstances, Shinigami who possessed Kido-type Zanpakuto either refrained from using them or transferred to other divisions. Of course, strength always spoke for itself. Those who transferred were invariably the weaker ones. Powerful Shinigami, even if their Zanpakuto or Kido-type, still held corresponding status and authority within the 11th division. Ichino's was one such example. Even though his Zanpakuto was a light-type, he remained a formidable fighter. I am the lieutenant of the 11th division, Ichino's Maki. Please take care of me. Kyoya, 5th seat of the 11th division, please take care of me. Facing Ichino's, Kyoya didn't dare to be careless. After all, Ichino's Maki is the vice captain of the 11th division, with a 5th class Raryoku, 2 full ranks above Kyoya's. The higher the Raryoku class, the more exponentially the gap between each rank grew. In fact, beyond 3rd class Raryoku, the difference within the same rank could be more staggering than the gap between 20th and 3rd class. Pushing aside his worries about the One Piece achievement system's sudden inactivity, Kyoya raised his Zanpakuto and pointed it at Ichino's. Whoosh! In an instant, Kyoya appeared right in front of Ichino's, bringing his sword down in a fierce slash. Clang! The metallic clash rang out, but unlike the previous officers, Ichino's didn't collapse under Kyoya's strike. That said, in terms of pure physical strength, Ichino's in his base state still couldn't match Kyoya. Therefore, though he blocked Kyoya's attack, the force sent Ichino's skidding backward, his feet leaving shallow trails on the ground. What a powerful strength, Ichino's thought to himself. If my Ryutsu were on the same level as his, I'd likely be overwhelmed too, but… Boom! Ichino's Ryutsu erupted, and dense reishi gathered around his body. Halting his retreat, Ichino's surged forward instead, turning into a blur as he launched his own assault. Clang! With the increase of his Ryutsu, Ichino's speed and strength were greatly enhanced. The clash of their Zanpakuto sent a shockwave rippling outward, and the ground beneath their feet cracked under the force of their collision. Clang! 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 Kyoya and Ichino's Maki's Zanpakuto became streaks of afterimages, clashing repeatedly in a rapid, rhythmic exchange of strikes. Is Ichino's strong? Undoubtedly. If he weren't, he wouldn't be the lieutenant of the 11th division. But to Kyoya, this level of strength wasn't particularly overwhelming. The speed of Ichino's slashes was comparable to what Kyoya had faced months ago against Jin. Back then, Kyoya had managed to escape unscathed from Jin's attacks thanks to his observation haki. Now, with his strength increased 30-fold compared to that time, he could easily track Ichino's slashes even without relying on haki, holding his ground effortlessly in their duel. At this moment, Kyoya also realized just how much Jin had been holding back against him back then. Specifically, Jin had suppressed the explosive boost in power from his Ryutsu. Even though both had 5th class Raryoku, the difference in their amplification shouldn't have been as absurd as this. Though Jin was much younger than Ichino's, his swordsmanship was in no way inferior. In Kyoya's perception, the pressure Ichino's exerted now was nowhere near what Jin had imposed on him before. This guy, seeing all his attacks being effortlessly blocked, even Ichino's couldn't help but feel Kyoya's threat level skyrocket. At this rate, he wouldn't last. Ichino's knew that much. His current speed and strength came from forcibly amplifying his Ryutsu. Kyoya, on the other hand, matched him with pure physical prowess alone. Once his Ryutsu ran low, Kyoya would easily overpower him. Even Ichino's felt helpless against such a sheer gap in physical ability. But that was just how it was. Sometimes, the difference between people was even greater than that between humans and dogs. Talent and physique, Ryutsu, comprehension, the very essence of one's soul. Individually, the gaps might seem small, but stacked together, they created the divide between talentless, mediocre, genius, and monster. I've been a Shinigami for over 20 years, fought in thousands of battles, and never slacked in training. I refuse to believe that 20 years of effort can't surpass a so-called genius who hasn't even trained for a full year. Ichino's eyes darkened slightly. From Kyoya's earlier fights, he already knew it was only a matter of time before Kyoya surpassed him. But it couldn't be now. With that thought, Ichino's abruptly shifted tactics. No longer engaging in direct clashes, instead he began striking opportunistically with Shunpo. 10/5, 5:55 p.m. Singranbir 68007, Chapter 39 Shikai once again. Unfortunately, this move was useless against Kyoya. It was true that Kyoya's training in Zanjutsu, Hakuda, Hoho, and Kido fell somewhat short compared to that of Ichino's, who had been a Shinigami for over 20 years. However, what Kyoya possessed was not limited to the abilities of the Bleach world. The results of his training, unlocked through the One Piece achievement system, though only an instant had passed in the Bleach world, were no illusion. The memories of that training and the physical enhancements it brought were very real. Moreover, Kyoya still had his observation haki as a trump card. Without hesitation, a faint crimson light flickered in Kyoya's eyes as he activated his observation haki. Clang, 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 clang. With the assistance of observation haki, Ichino's movements were completely transparent to Kyoya. And Ichino's shunpo speed was not yet fast enough to overwhelm Kyoya's reaction time. Therefore, even though Ichino's attacks appeared like a storm of relentless strikes, Kyoya blocked every single one without taking a single scratch. This guy is strong. After a full minute, Ichino's halted his assault, stopping in front of Kyoya while panting heavily. Though only a minute had passed, the intensity of the fight was no less exhausting than an hour of high-level Hakuda training for Ichino's. Both his Raryoku and physical stamina had been drained significantly. It seems, I was too arrogant. After steadying his breathing, Ichino spoke to Kyoya. I thought this form would be enough to force you to reveal more of your abilities. But now I see that if I don't go all out, I might even lose to you. Kyoya-kun, from here on out, you'd better be careful. After all, if I unleash my full power, I can't guarantee I'll be able to hold back at the moment of killing you. Don't worry, Lieutenant Ichino's. My strength isn't as weak as you think. Is that so? Then, here I come. After delivering his warning, Ichino's took a deep breath, gripping the hilt of his Zanpakuto with both hands as his Ryutsu erupted. Shine, Nijigasumi! With his shout, Ichino's Ryutsu transformed into a dreamlike spectrum of colors, and at the same time, his Ryutsu surged several times over. A violent wave of Ryutsu exploded outward from Ichino's, forming a tangible shockwave. From above, it looked as though an invisible force was sweeping across the battlefield. Of course, given Ichino's Maki's current level of Raryoku, the resulting wind pressure only caused minor disturbances for the surrounding Shinigami. At most, they had to shield their eyes to prevent dust kicked up by the shockwave from getting in. The release command is the same as mine. Hearing Ichino's Zanpakuto's Shikai phrase, Kyoya was momentarily stunned. To be honest, in Kyoya's memory, there had never been a Zanpakuto with identical release commands. However, this didn't particularly bother Kyoya. After all, the so-called release command was essentially an agreement between a Shinigami and their Zanpakuto, a key used to call upon the Zanpakuto's power. The most important factor in releasing a Zanpakuto was still its name. As long as the Zanpakuto's spirit had told its Shinigami its name, the release command could be decided by either the Shinigami or the Zanpakuto itself. That said, most Zanpakuto's release commands were related to their abilities, and due to differences in personality between Shinigami and their Zanpakuto, while some release commands were similar, identical ones were rare. Previously, when Kyoya gained Borsellino's acknowledgement and was permitted to use his abilities, Borsellino, finding it too troublesome, allowed Kyoya to set his own Shikai phrase. And Kyoya, believing that since Borsellino had become the strongest light-type Zanpakuto, using Shine was fitting enough. Now, hearing Ichino's use the same release phrase, Kyoya was slightly surprised, but he didn't find it particularly problematic. Same release command, same light-type Zanpakuto, whoever was weaker would be the one left embarrassed. Colorful gem of rainbow mist. After releasing his Zanpakuto, Ichino swung his blade in a circular motion before him. Along the path of Nijigasumi's arc, hundreds of reishi blades condensed from light formed a ring, which he then directed toward Kyoya in a relentless assault. Swish, swish, swish. Boom, 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 boom. Kyoya instantly flashed away with Shunpo, evading the spot where he had been standing just moments before. The blades struck the ground, blasting massive craters. Slash, slash, slash. Kyoya swung his Zanpakuto, unleashing white flying slashes that clashed against the light blades of colorful gem of rainbow mist, triggering violent explosions. Though Kyoya's comprehension of breadth of all things wasn't yet profound, his 30-fold increase in strength amplified the power of his flying slashes tremendously. Each of his flying slashes shattered over a dozen light blades. Unfortunately, the sheer number of blades Ichino's Maki had unleashed was overwhelming. At Kyoya's current sword-swinging speed, there was no way he could destroy all of them before they reached him. More importantly, while Kyoya was preoccupied with deflecting the blades, Ichino stood watch like a predator, waiting for the slightest opening. The moment Kyoya showed any weakness, he would strike with an even fiercer attack. Realizing this, Kyoya ceased launching flying slashes. Instead, he retreated while dodging the light blades, holding his Zanpakuto horizontally before him. Placing his left hand against the flat of the blade, he unleashed his Ryutsu. Shine, Ama no Murakumo. As his hand swept across the blade, his Zanpakuto transformed into a sword of condensed golden light, the Ama no Murakumo. At the same time, likely due to his increased Raryoku, Kyoya found that, unlike his initial partial Shikai, he could now exert slight control over light itself. Even the colorful gem of rainbow mist unleashed by Ichino's was no exception. 10/5, 5:58 p.m. Singranbir 68007, Chapter 40 Restrained. In the One Piece world, superior devil fruits held a great advantage over inferior ones. The Mera Mera no Mi and the Magu Magu no Mi are the most classic examples. Ace, who had fought Jinbei for 7 days and nights without a clear victor and even escaped from Marine Admiral Aokiji Kuzan, was proof of his immense strength. Aokiji Kuzan and Akainu Sakazuki fought for 10 days and nights before a winner was decided. This shows that their strength was nearly equal. By this logic, even if Ace couldn't defeat Sakazuki, he should have been able to escape. Yet the reality was that Sakazuki severely wounded Ace with a single, effortless attack. This was the absolute suppression of a superior devil fruit over an inferior one. Now, the situation between Kyoya and Ichino's was similar to that of Ace and Sakazuki. However, Kyoya's strength wasn't as overwhelming as Sakazuki's. In fact, if you excluded his observation haki, Kyoya's overall combat ability was slightly inferior to Ichino's. Therefore, Kyoya's battle against Ichino's couldn't possibly be as one-sided as Sakazuki's instant defeat of Ace. That said, contesting control over light with Ichino's was entirely within Kyoya's capabilities. The title of strongest within a certain element wasn't just for show. Its most fundamental power, Tenso Jurin, allowed the elder to command the corresponding element, using it to enhance abilities while suppressing their enemy. As the strongest Zanpakuto of the light element once released, even though Ichino's Maki's Raryoku surpassed Kyoya's, his mastery over light couldn't compare to Kyoya's. Boom, 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 deafening explosions erupted, and in an instant, Ichino's colorful gem of rainbow mist was detonated by Kyoya. What? Shocked by the destruction of his technique, Ichino's was stunned. He didn't even understand how Kyoya had dismantled his attack. All he knew was that after Kyoya released his Zanpakuto, he had completely lost control over the sword beams formed by his colorful gem of rainbow mist. Amid the blazing light, Ichino's faintly saw Kyoya swinging his blade toward his position. Acting on instinct, Ichino's Maki immediately resorted to his hidden ability, invisibility. In an instant, the air around Ichino's distorted, and his figure vanished from the training grounds. This ability allowed him to manipulate the refraction of light around him, rendering himself invisible. Maki had always known that this technique would draw disdain from the members of the 11th Division, so he had never used it openly in front of them. But now, he felt that if he continued to hide it, Kyoya might defeat him in an instant. It wasn't hard to imagine that a genius like Kyoya wouldn't be satisfied with just the position of lieutenant after joining the 11th Division. In fact, judging by how Kyoya had immediately challenged the lowest-seated officer upon joining, Ichino's could tell Kyoya's true target was Kigenho. Among all the Gote 13, only the captain of the 11th Division could be replaced simply by defeating the current captain in combat. The other 12 divisions, captains need to be nominated by 3 or more captains, and more than 6 captains must personally prove that they possess captain-level power, or perform their Zanpakuto's Bankai in the presence of 3 or more captains before they can become captain. After defeating Ichino's, Kyoya's next target would undoubtedly be Kigenho. As one of Kigenjo's most loyal subordinates, Ichino's believed that even if he couldn't stop every enemy who posed a threat to the captain, he should at least ensure that Kigenho understood their abilities, giving him an advantage in any future battles. After all, within the Gote 13, Zanpakuto with unknown abilities are always the most feared. For those Shinigami whose names and abilities are already known, unless they reach Yamamoto's level, even captains can be put in a difficult position if their powers are countered. Well, actually, even Yamamoto himself was often the first target in many of Soul Society's crises, with enemies always finding ways to weaken him first. For example, Aizen only dared to declare war on Soul Society after creating Wunderweiss Margula, effectively sealing Yamamoto's Zanpakuto. Or Yuach, the progenitor of the Quincy's, who had someone impersonate him as a decoy. The moment Yamamoto let his guard down after slaying the fake Yuach, his Bankai was stolen. Even if it meant being despised and ostracized by the rest of the 11th Division, Ichino's was determined to force Kyoya to reveal more of his power. Boom! A white crescent slash tore through the ground, cutting dozens of meters deep. Seeing Ichino's dodge his attack, Kyoya wasn't surprised. While his increased power had significantly amplified the force behind his flying slashes, their speed hadn't improved as drastically. Combined with the distance between them, it wasn't difficult for Ichino's to evade once he noticed the attack. In fact, even in the One Piece world, many of the flying slashes from the greatest swordsman in the world Dracul Mihawk had been dodged. With Ichino's vanishing from sight, Kyoya smirked. This move of his would be a trump card against Shinigami who hadn't honed their Reikaku to a gem, RTAIN level. But unfortunately, such tricks were useless against Kyoya. For one, Kyoya's control over light surpassed Ichino's, so he could easily sense the densest concentration of light, making Ichino's stand out like a glaring light bulb in his perception. Secondly, Kyoya's observation haki is a super sense operating independently of vision. A mere light-bending illusion cannot be hidden from Kyoya's observation haki at all. Raising his Ama no Murakumo, Kyoya swung it down toward Ichino's location. Boom! Golden light condensed, transforming into a slash over 10 meters tall that instantly engulfed Ichino's position. So fast, I can't dodge this. Ichino's had intended to ambush Kyoya while invisible, but he never expected Kyoya to unleash such an attack. It was as if Kyoya had seen right through his invisibility. More importantly, the speed and power of this fly slash was at least 3 times greater than the previous one. In this critical moment, Ichino's finally unleashed his strongest ability.